Today I'm here with Travis Woyen, who by day is a technology guy and by night is a passionate musician. So it's good to have you here, Travis. And I'm really excited to talk with you today about Boethius. Bohu, that's what somebody said online the other day, Bohu. I think that's the way Stephen Blackwood introduces him. Stephen Blackwood is one of the foremost experts on Boethius, I guess. And I've listened to some of his talks. But just to give a little background on Boethius, he was a Roman senator and a philosopher who lived from 476 to 524. You might notice if you do some adding that his life was cut short at the age of 48 when he was savagely killed by the leaders of the Roman Empire because of some minor infraction. But prior to his death, he wrote quite a lot. And he also, one of the things that he did that was so tremendous was that this was at the end of the Roman Empire during a time when Greek was getting phased out as a language, and yet so much of the knowledge of the past was written in Greek. So he took the time to translate all of Aristotle from Greek into Latin. So that gave us a heads up on Aristotle that probably would have taken a long time afterwards otherwise. And he also did a lot of work on music theory. And when he was in prison awaiting his death, he wrote something called The Consolation of Philosophy. And I just want to read one little quote from something about the Consolation of Philosophy, because I think that'll give us an idea of what kind of guy this was. So I'm going to share screen here. Let's see, Boethius. I guess it's that one there. So everybody, you can see this, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Boethius, The Consolations of Philosophy, contains a dialogue wherein philosophy, like a physician, seeks to cure Boethius's soul from its malady brought on by his decrease in fortune. Yeah, that's an understatement. You're in prison awaiting your execution, and it's your decrease in fortune. But anyway, philosophy utilizes, he personifies philosophy in this, and philosophy utilizes what she calls some gentle and pleasant remedy which may prepare you for the stronger medicine. This remedy is music with its graces. So music prepares you, but then he goes on to say that philosophy allows for a more profound awareness of our afflictions, and therefore we have this deep-seated pain which continues long after the music stops, and that's when you need philosophy. So that's a little bit of background on Boethius. And I actually had sent you this material much earlier so that we could talk about, there was a video I sent you about Boethius that talks about the way that he saw music intersecting with all the areas of knowledge, and especially with mathematics. He was one of the first guys, I guess, who brought the whole idea of the quadrivium into the education of the day. And music and mathematics were two parts of the quadrivium that were very important educationally for upper range students. Mm-hmm. So you came up with something about Pythagoras, and I'm really eager to hear what that is.
Well, and to some degree, of course, this carried Pythagorean ideas into the quadrivium. Of course, the Pythagoreans themselves were, I don't think I'm wrong in saying, somewhat obsessive about mathematical ratios and relationships, both spatial and otherwise. This extended into music, and this is Pythagoras did a lot of work, or at least was attributed with having done a lot of work based on tuning and based on, for example, finding nodes on a string, for example, a lyre string, or it would be the same with any stringed instrument, finding harmonic nodes and basing tuning systems off of that. And so there's that proportionality in tuning it's known as Pythagorean tuning. And it was a way of assembling what we have as sort of the 12-tone Western musical scale. the funny thing with Pythagorean tuning is that it works in a limited range, but it doesn't work in a expanded range. That's why we have different tuning systems now. I might be getting a little bit ahead of things there.
So what do you mean by, yeah, you need to tell me what you mean by an expanded range and a limited range. What,
Yeah.
Maybe I don't know that background. So.
Oh, okay. Well, it's just to sort of describe without getting completely into the nuts and bolts on like tempered tuning and things like that. Basically, if you look at a musical scale, you start with your root note, which is considered your 1. Okay, and if you want to find the octave of that, the ratio is basically a 2-to-1 ratio. So if you double the frequency or half the frequency, you have an octave either higher or lower than your original note.
Mm-hmm.
And now if you take that original frequency, we'll say, for example, A is 440 in modern Western tuning, generally. So you double that, you have 880, that's also an A, but it's an A an octave higher. If you take that 440 times 3 and divide by 2, that's 660. That's an E, so that's the 5th. So the 3-to-2 ratio gives you a 5th. And you can keep doing these ratios to get more and more notes, basically to assemble a scale. And that's what the Pythagoreans, because they loved ratios and they loved, A squared plus B squared equals C squared, whether it be geometrically, whether it be musically, whether it be other things, they liked having these sort of nicely tucked together mathematical formulas that would illustrate these sort of consonances in the world.
Okay, but now I got to ask a question. In terms of the notes on a scale, are they a social construct, so to speak? Or were those notes chosen by this ratio, or were people already singing? Do you know what I mean? Like the do re mi thing that
Yeah.
we tend to sing in now. Like I can go up half a note or a note, but I can't go anywhere in between a half a note and a note. You know what I mean? It's like my voice slots into these things. Is that a social construct that they devised because of these ratios, or did the ratios line up with something that people were already doing?
I think the latter. The reason I say so, if you get into
really mysterious.
If you get into non-Western music systems, for example, like Indian music is a perfect example of this. There are way more tones in Indian music than there are in Western music, where we're pretty much locked down to 12 tones at this point. And even in sort of the ancient Greek times, you were still pretty much within that range. So it really kind of is a Western convention, this idea of 12 notes, because, and I don't know enough about Indian music theory to really, but you can listen to it and you can hear all sorts of things that sound to the Western ear very out of tune, and they're not out of tune in that context, because
that's not a matter of hertz, right? That's just a matter of getting in between the half tones that we typically think of, or
yeah, I mean, and it literally is. It's the difference between, it's just a slightly lower or higher frequency than a pitch that we would expect. So, for example, there may be a different note value instead of 440, like we said for A. There may be another note value that they would do that would be like, I don't know, 430, which would seem like a flat A to the Western ear, because that's what we're expecting. But could work within that system. And then
but they're doing it on purpose.
Yeah, exactly, because their system accommodates that. And the and sort of the irony with the Pythagorean system was, while it worked within an octave, and then you would think, because you can just double everything and make the next octave higher, and double everything and make the next octave higher, that would keep working, and it doesn't. It falls apart. Eventually, you wind up with what's called a Wolf fifth, which is the fifth, the perfect fifth of a note like an A and an E, are considered the most consonant harmonies that aren't an octave. And so when that doesn't line up anymore, it sounds horrid. It really sounds bad, and you can find examples that they've done with sine waves on YouTube. But if you just look up a Wolf fifth, and it sounds awful. Similar things, tuning third.
And this is another dumb question, but is this kind of why on a piano, when you get up into the very high range or the very low range, you're not really hearing the notes the way that you would in the middle range?
It depends on how the piano is tuned, really, because what they ultimately came down to was you had to have a compromise that would allow you to play in multiple keys. So either you would tune the instrument all to one key, so it would be based off of one reference, and then you could play in that key and everything was okay. And if you played in a different key, it would start getting bad. It would get
Oh,
bad
wow.
really fast. So
Wow.
if you look at like a modern tempered tuning system, and and by the time you had organs and pianos and harpsichords, like the well-tempered clavier, by Bach,
Uh-huh.
that sort of thing, you had tuning temperament systems already put into place by then that would allow them to play across multiple keys and not sound horrifying once they got to certain notes. So then they could use thirds, and they could use, and when you think in modern music, like the third and the sixth are probably the two most important pitches in a scale for us to determine sharps, or not sharps, but majors and minors.
Mhm.
So if you have a sharp third or a flat third or that sort of thing, that's going to determine your major and minor. And that's why so much older music didn't dance around with thirds especially that much, because they would sound out of tune at a certain point on the instrument.
Isn't it, my memory might not be serving me correctly, but isn't a sixth the one that we typically use to wrap around? If you come to the end of a song and you want to wrap around, come back and not finish up, but like worship leaders will often wrap around at the end of a song. They'll bring it back so that you can sing. Because if you finish, then it sounds stupid to go back and fit in again. So they don't quite finish. They I think they use the sixth as a.
A lot of times there will be a seventh, because the seventh the seventh is the note below the octave. So if you're going to end on your starting note or on your starting chord, and if you have the seventh, it really wants to resolve to the octave. So a lot of times that'll be the case too.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, and people who do early music could have all sorts of different tuning systems and things like they'll use, but it's interesting how the development of that has gone. But the other thing that's interesting about it is, while the original thing about the ratios working seems like this incredibly simple, elegant mathematical resolution to a question, when you actually play it out mathematically, it starts to fall apart once you get too far from your original reference. Like you get too far out from where you're starting, and things stop sounding consonant. They start sounding dissonant, even though the whole thing was dreamed up as a way to determine consonants. So it falls into this is my pet theory here, for which there's basically no evidence outside of my pet theoriness. But I think about this with relation to, okay, so like physics, right? So the bigger something gets and the smaller something gets, the less it makes sense to us at all. The more we are capable of interacting with it, that basically determines our capacity to comprehend it and to really to know it, sort of in the sense of not just as a proposition or as an abstraction, but to actually interact with it and actually have, in a relational knowledge with it. And the further we get away from
kind of
that,
what the physicists call the messy middle. We're at the messy middle. Yeah.
And it's the middle where oddly things actually make sense. And then you start getting further and further away from that, to where it's outside of where we're really able to directly interact, and we're just trying to infer things from other testing. And all of a sudden you go, well, this doesn't seem to track with anything else. So while something may seem to make sense where we're able to interact with it, the further you get away from that in scale, in time, in space, what have you, it seems like these things tend to fall apart as far as our ability to actually comprehend them.
Mm-hmm. Well, that fits in perfectly with Stephen Wolfram's theory of everything.
Okay, and I've seen you talking about that. I've been gonna look into, and I haven't actually gotten caught up at all on that. So
because well, I'm going to pause for just a second so I can bring up a picture of his theory of everything and show you how this works.
Okay.
So I'm going to share screen here and show you a visual summary of Wolfram's physics project. Just as a quick recap, it starts out with one simple rule. This is the rule right here. Whenever you see this conformation, it changes to this conformation.
Okay.
Which I think this one is just beautiful because it's like love, goodness, beauty, and truth. Or love, beauty, goodness, and truth, So anyway, this changes to this. And over time, as you begin to institute these changes, you get this bunch of, it starts moving this way and starts building something. And eventually, not very long into it, you start getting these things that look like neural networks.
Hmm.
And the farther it goes, the more complex it becomes. And it's computationally irreducible in that you cannot determine the future from what you see here.
Okay.
You just have to keep playing it out, playing it out, playing it out until you get to something. But there's this cool thing that happens in the midst of this thing, that there are pockets of computational reducibility. And we are, because of our place in this universe that goes from very large to very small, we're kind of in the middle. We're in one of those pockets of reducibility that allow us to do physics and math and figure things out about music mathematically and find things that are computationally reducible. We can find answers, but that's only because we're in this pocket of computational reducibility.
Interesting.
Now, this is what he calls his multi-way states causal graph, because, and the way that they determine cause and effect in this theory is somewhat different than what you think of cause and effect in modern physics. And that's because time works slightly different in this system, in that time is an updating event. So whenever this grows to this, or this grows to this, that's called an updating event.
Okay.
And those updating events are happening at different times on different paths of this thing.
Okay.
Okay. So the only way that we can look at time is along the thread of time that we are inhabiting, because we are just a small part of this whole big thing. He calls this big thing a ruliad. It's all possible rules operating, all possible rules updating all possible choices.
Okay.
Okay. And so we're just we inhabit some corner of this universe where for us, things are computationally reducible, but there are a lot of other places out here where it's not computationally reducible for us, but there might be other participants or beings that are in the rest of this thing who have a different kind of computational reducibility or a different way of seeing the world that allows them to see a different aspect of this whole ruliad than what we see. So we only, we see in a glass darkly, basically, is what the scripture tells us. And interesting, the reason I'm hung up on this thing is I've watched Wolfram's progress on this over the last couple of years. And his progress tends to be towards finding philosophers or theologians that can give him some answers, because he's never thought about theology before, but now he's thinking about theology.
Okay.
This has forced him to start thinking about theology. So.
And it's interesting in a way too. And it's kind of funny as how the world has changed in, well, the last few thousand years, but you don't have to go that far back, because when you think, you think about, we're talking about Wolframs Theory, excuse me, and seeking out people to discuss the theological implications of a thing or the theological ideas about a thing, and sort of coming off of the Pythagoreans and Boethius, for whom the idea of physics and theology were utterly interrelated conceptual spaces. And I mean, the Pythagoreans really, to what degree they were engaging with physics, it was their theology and so on and so forth. So it's interesting, just that juxtaposition in how different the modern world is from, the past world. And especially when you're thinking about really between physics and theology. I mean, in both cases, you're dealing, especially when you're getting with physics outside of like direct Newtonian physics, you're getting into a lot of abstraction. And, you know, and a lot of things like that where, you know, actually there should be a lot of crossover when you think about it.
Well, in terms of these harmonics, I mean, I know that the ancients believed in the harmonics of the spheres, and that the planets moved according to these harmonics, and that there was a harmonic aspect to the universe, that the movements of the planets corresponded in some way to a kind of music.
Mm-hmm.
And then they also thought that there was a kind of music in the way that social groups interacted, that the harmony of social groups was another kind of music. And then that the instrumental music, including the vocal instrument, all of that instrumental music was yet another kind of music, which is the music that we tend to think of when we think about hearing something. But have you ever heard any crossover with that whole harmonics idea with the idea of the light spectrum and color? Or
I haven't directly, but
well, I mean, it obviously wouldn't be hertz, but I wonder if there isn't some sort of proportionality in where colors show up along the color spectrum.
Well,
it would be similar to.
I think the thing is you can make a conversion. So if we're talking about it, you know, like a mathematical relationship. So if we say the mathematical relationship between the light spectrum frequency of a perceived blue, say, for example, and of course, you know, at that point you have to qualify what blueness is.
Yes, I mean, there are there's a lot of wiggle room in blue. Yes.
Yeah. And you know, but thinking like, you know, or versus red, right? So there could be that variance there, because it's reducible to mathematics. You can take, you know, the frequency of the wavelength, you could translate that into a proportion, right? And then you can translate that to hertz, and you can say, okay, well, this is proportionate to, you know, this variance in hertz, and then, you know, and maybe there is a commonality there proportionally. Or maybe there isn't, you know.
Well, I wonder about, you know, people who have synesthesia, who experience color as music, or people who experience music as colored, as color. I wonder if that works proportionally for them. I mean, I wonder if it's that kind of conversion. The reason I asked about the color and the light thing is that I was watching a video that Paul was doing today, talking to Michael Martin, this writer who is writing about something called Sociology, which, roughly speaking, at a very simplistic level, Sociology is thinking about where glory breaks through into the universe. And one or the other of them, or maybe somebody else I was listening to, I don't remember, I listened to a bunch of stuff today, was talking about this idea that color is what takes place at the intersection between light and dark. I guess it was Goethe who came up with this idea based on looking through a prism and noticing that when he looked through a prism at a window, that the left and upper frame of the window came out as blue and green, and the right and lower frame of the window came out as the opposites, the orange and red. And I thought that was an interesting idea about color being at the intersection of light and dark, because what you'll notice, well, Michael mentioned one of the things that you notice. I notice this all the time when I'm walking up the hill in the evening with our dog. I get up to the top of the hill, I can see the sun setting, and the sunset, and I'm looking at it, is orange and red and yellow. Then I turn around, I start walking down the hill, and over in the east, the east has turned these beautiful shades of soft purple and blue and magenta, shading down into the landscape. And so the opposites are on either sides of us, right? But then what you'll notice if you're outside when the light starts to fade is that colors become less and less and less saturated, and they become more and more and more neutral, until eventually, when it's dark, all you can, even if you can see the trees against the moon, all you see is black, basically a complete neutral. So color shows up at that intersection between light and dark, but it's proportional, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it depends on how much light and how much dark. What that proportion is going to tell you how much saturation there's going to be in the color.
Yeah.
And so one of my pet theories is this thing that everything in the universe, I think it probably gets down to every particle, but certainly every atom or molecule in the universe is a result of the proportions of various elements and principles that make up the universe. And one of the proportions would be, let's say, balance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
So you can have something that's completely balanced, completely in equilibrium, or something that's completely imbalanced right at the edge of just ready to topple over, right?
Yeah.
And so between those two things, there's a proportional scale.
Okay.
And you can pick a point along that proportional scale, theoretically, and create that much balance, whether it's in music or in painting or in creating a world. and color is the same way. You can choose a certain proportion of saturation in the color. The distance between light and dark, you can choose a certain proportion between light and dark. You can choose a certain proportion of the chemical makeup of different flavors. And where those, not that everything has all of those things in it, but everything has some of those things in it, and everything, the node would be where those different proportions intersect. That intersection would be the intersection of all those proportions.
Yeah.
It makes that particular thing unique in all the universe. And I mean, I've heard it said that down at the quark level, that there is no uniqueness, that all the quarks are all the charm quarks are the same, and all the up quarks are the same, and all the down quarks are the same, fine. But when they unite together, they're uniting together in proportion.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. So proportion to me is like very fundamental to the universe. Wolfram's theory is that the universe is fundamentally computational. And I don't know what he means by computational, but my physicist friend that I talked to, he says computational means two things. First of all, there has to be, before there can be computation, there has to be a mechanism for the computation to take place with it, right? And that computation is fundamentally choice.
Okay.
You're either choosing A or B. You're either choosing 0 or 1. That is what computation is. So, and one of the really I just thought about this the other day. One of the really interesting things is that the distance between 0 and 1 is infinite, and it's the largest infinity that there is. I mean, there's a lot of different sizes of infinities, but between 0 and 1, it's infinite, because you can go 0.0000000 until you get to 1 at the end. But then you have 0.0000 until you get to 2. But in between all those zeros, each one of those has an infinite range as well. And so between 0 and 1 is this infinite. So let's say the whole universe is a choice between 0 and 1, but there's all these infinite possibilities in that range between 0 and 1. And every one of those choices is a choice for that particular space on the place between 0 and 1, and not some other place.
Yeah.
And so in the construction of the universe, everything is a choice. But then I think also that we were created with also that freedom of choice, because we're created in the image of the creator. And if he's all about freely choosing, then we are also all about freely choosing. We got messed up and made the wrong choice at the beginning. so that makes it more difficult for us to make wise choices now. But anyway, that was what I was thinking about. And when I'm thinking about, I want to ask you this about music, because, you know, in Isaiah 64, I think it is, where it talks about the potter and the clay, that he is the potter and we are the clay. that he's molding and making us. You know, when you're working with clay, I don't know if you've ever tried that. There comes a point where sometimes the clay sort of gets a mind of its own, and the clay will start going wacky, and it doesn't matter what the potter does, the clay just blobs off and does some weird thing.
Yeah.
And when that starts to happen, there's really no way to bring it back except to take the whole thing, smash it down, and start all over again. So creativity has both a destructive and a creative aspect. And sometimes the destructive aspect is necessary to get the creative aspect to where you really are hoping for it to be.
Yeah.
Right. I know it's that way in painting, because sometimes I'll have to paint over something and mess it up and create more chaos in order to bring it back to a freshness and aliveness and get it to really show what it was meant to be.
Yeah.
Do you find that same thing in music?
Yeah, well, yeah, I call it extreme editing. Okay, so I have the situation where anything I've ever pretty close to anyway. I shouldn't say everything, but nearly everything I've ever written musically, I overwrote. It was way. I used to joke every song I wrote was 8 minutes long, no matter what it was, because it was just because it's easier to have ideas, especially when you have something like, I think I said it to you once before in one of our earlier conversations, because unlike, for example, illustration, if I'm drawing a dog, really it comes down to, does this look like a dog? Whereas with music, there's nothing limiting you to a direct representation. So everything is sort of an abstract representation of a thing. So there's nothing really stopping you outside of, the forms of music itself and taste. And so I have this tendency to be incredibly long-winded musically, and then I have to just cut things out and cut things like, okay, what's the point in this? What's the point in this? Does this advance anything? Like, what are the strongest things here? What are the strongest things that I have to work from here? And then get the things out of the way that are keeping that from being significant, because it's really easy for me to just have too much of everything. So it's just kind of a string of ideas instead of
there's no boundary, right? So if there's no boundary, if there's no edge, then you don't, there's no necessity to invent. Necessity is the mother of invention, right? So
and I think constraint, when you talk about choices, this is something that I always think about, sort of the genius of J.S. Bach. And you can read stories about this, where he could improvise fugue in 3 voices. You give him a theme and he goes off with it, and that's incomprehensible to me because I can't come anywhere close to that. But the reason he can do that, now if you start going into what constitutes fugue, there's a lot of rules in fugue. Like, you don't do this, you don't do that, you do this, you do this, you do this. And all of those constraints are the things that allow someone who is also incredibly talented and has the brain for it to, harmonize multiple voices off the top of his head, off of a theme someone else gave him in fugue, and then so it's so he could do these massive improvisations that were astonishing to your average onlooker. But had he been given a completely blank slate, like there's no form, just do something, I don't know that anyone could do that because there's too many options available.
Yeah.
Similar to, if Western music, if you tried to do something the scope of like a Western orchestra, and you were trying to do it without the limitations of 12 tones, if you're trying to do it with like an Indian scale, it would be a lot trickier in a lot of ways, because all of a sudden, all of these harmonizations that are happening, well, that could get really difficult really quickly.
Yeah, I think I don't remember if you sent it to me or if I sent it to you, but there's some guy on the internet that did a video of a song that he wrote based on the digits of pi. And eventually that video got 10 million views. And then it went completely viral because then they
Mhm.
started copying it on Facebook and all sorts of
Oh,
places.
yeah.
And then they ended up talking about it on the mass media news, and he got interviewed and all this kind of stuff. And that's one where there was a very tight constraint.
Hmm.
He had to work within the digits of pi.
Yeah.
And he set himself a rule base. He made a 0 to 9 on this keyboard
Hmm.
and determined where the digits were on the keyboard. I mean, I think it was 1 through 8 was the scale, and then
Yeah.
the 0 and 9 were the ones on either side of that. And he
Okay.
just used that, and he used his right hand to play the digit of pi
Hmm.
in an octave, and then his left hand he did like arpeggios that interwove with it so that there were harmonies created on the left hand. The thing that made it beautiful was the not the rhythm exactly. What do you call the distances? The
Interval.
intervals, the time intervals between notes. So it was the way that he played with the timing as he, he'd da 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 dee da dee da dee 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 da da, like
Yeah.
that. And that's what made it beautiful, even though it's completely random, right?
Yeah.
But it didn't sound random when he got done. But
Yeah.
that's again where he had these two very tight constraints that he had to work within, and so he was able to create something beautiful out of that. So,
Yeah.
but I want to get back to what you were saying before about like you said when there's nothing stopping you, and that made me think about something that Boethius said in his when he's talking about music in the Consolation of Philosophy. He's talking about how music is when it's harmonious and melodious, it's beautiful and it creates pleasure for people and they enjoy it. And that when it's disjointed and too complex and atonal and all of that kind of thing, that can be a signal that a people are becoming immoral and perverted. And so this was apparently part of the philosophy of music over a long period of time after, and Boethius was probably riffing off of Aristotle, and I think Augustine also had written something about theory of music. But then along comes Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia,
Yeah.
who used music, very harmonious, melodious, powerful music, to actually generate in the people a very destructive force of a false kind of a unity that created, all this ugliness.
Yeah.
So what do you think that's all about? And I mean, and then when you think about today, the direction that music has taken, do you think that direction that music has taken is a reflection on the direction that our way of looking at the world, the direction that's taken as well, the nihilism and the postmodernism?
Let's see. I think starting from the first point about, for example, like in the great sort of ideological tyrannies of the 20th century, and this is one of those things. It's sort of an aside. When I was in high school, I remember I was watching the Olympics, and a buddy of mine and I they were doing national anthems, and they're like, it sounds bad to say it, but the Soviet national anthem has a way better tune than ours.
Probably easier to sing.
Well, but that's a part of it. And you think, well, if you're going to have a national anthem, having one that people can sing along with is probably an ideal thing. And that's one thing about when you talk about music as sort of a mass, a thing for people to gather around, for example. It needs to be something that's comprehensible to them. Hence big, simple melodies, big, simple, sweeping melodies. When you think about the extent to which that's been used both in mass media and in the case of, Stalin's Russia and Nazi Germany. And
Yeah, so maybe that's the dangerous part of it. Maybe it's a good thing we don't.
Well, I mean, it's you can get all sorts of terrible results out of really nice things. I
Mhm.
mean, you can. It's
Well,
and
music has a power, right? It has the power for good and for ill.
well, and I think too, it's similar to rhetoric in a way. I think, yeah, in that one video you had sent over, he makes the comment about music actually being more closely tied to language, and that's probably where I've looked into it more.
Mhm.
And music understanding and acquisition being in some ways related to language acquisition, things like that. Um, and I think it probably isn't wrong to say that language and music very closely intersect, just in the sense that they are means of communication. They're probably, I mean, language is verbally based. The origin of language is verbal. The origin of music is almost certainly verbal. Um, I've, I can't imagine music arising with people from anything other than the voice as the first, as the first thing. So they probably emerged hand in hand with one another. And music, if you think about it that way, music is a form of communication, as a form of language, um, that gives, some other forms of implication, but it's, once again, it's not necessarily quite as direct as just simply speaking something. But think about it, think about even just sort of historically, music as a compression system. You think about like older folk music, that sort of thing, preserving stories, preserving ideas. You think about the entire concept of hymnody with churches is to teach theology in 5 verses or fewer, that could be sung by everyone in the congregation. You know what I mean? And then that goes back, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So there's a few different things involved in this. You can communicate a lot of ideas relatively easily with that, and in a way that people can remember, because the brain seems to be uniquely capable of remembering musical things better than just straight on prosaic speech. In that sense, I would say your average parishioner is probably more likely to get a part of a hymn stuck in their head than what their pastor had been saying on a Sunday morning.
Well, and that's exactly the danger with a lot of the modern contemporary worship music that is coming into the church. A lot of it is not exactly what you would call
Good.
what I say.
I'll just say good.
Well, yeah, it's not just whether it's good or not good, but it plants in a person's mind and heart the words that are there, but they may not be true.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
So we
they're
may
not.
be absorbing and remembering things that are not exactly true, but
Mhm.
they become a part of who we are because we sing them. The music becomes a part of who you are. It gets very integrated in your being. That's
So
why I think hymns are so important, because most of the hymns were, very scripturally based and had a
mhm.
lot of deep theological truth in them. And they bring back for me some of the deep lessons that God has taught me. And I will never forget the story of Harry Lee, who was this guy in China who became a Christian as a young man in an underground church and desperately wanted to come to America and study theology. But of course, the borders were all closed during those days. And eventually he was imprisoned at a concentration camp in China because of his Christianity. And he was there for like 30 years. And his job was to clean out the latrines because they hated him so much because he was a Christian, and they wouldn't allow him to sing or speak, because whenever he sang or spoke, he was always singing hymns or speaking scripture.
Yeah.
So he had to be silent. But he said that during all those times, internally, he could sing those hymns and they could
Yeah.
bring him encouragement and remind him of God's word,
Yeah.
and got him through that time. And eventually he got out of the concentration camp and was able to come to America and go to seminary. And that's where I met him. And I met him when I was a missionary,
Mhm.
and he was in the same mission organization then. And I think about that. How that could get you through that kind of horrific experience, right?
Yeah. Well, and I remember reading somewhere during the Soviet era, the Russian Orthodox Church basically was able to sort of maintain some level of scriptural integration, even when Bibles were banned in the Soviet Union, basically off of the sung liturgy that they were doing as part of their, for the divine service, I guess, and it makes sense. And and what you say about repetition, especially if you're repeating something over and over and over again, repetition sort of, this was kind of an aside. Another video I'd watched while I was kind of going down the rabbit hole for this was about, I don't know if you've ever heard the term Diabolus in musica.
Mm-mm.
So, okay, so this is kind of getting into the idea of the negative side or negative effects, assumed negative effects in music. And it's the matter of the tritone. And so there's a fairly modern mythology around the tritone. And so the tritone is the root note and then the flatted fifth or augmented fourth, depending on how you want to look at it. So it's basically, we hear it as a dissonance. And so there's a long-standing thing, and people have been taught this in music schools and in history of music classes, that in the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church banned the use of the tritone in music because they believed that it would bring the devil, conjure up the devil. And anyway,
I once heard a worship leader say that the C sus chord was the chord that brings the angels.
Oh, okay. Well, and this is so this is the funny thing about it, is that none of that's true. So the tritone is like, okay, so in the middle of the deal, and of course, and it gets blown up over and over and over again. So people have been saying this for years and years and years, really since
why did they call it the tritone if it's a diminished fifth?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think about, I can't think of offhand why. But it's
because a regular chord would be a 1 3 5, right?
Yeah.
And so there are 3 tones there.
Yeah.
And so maybe that was the bad third tone.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's really strange.
Yeah. So it's and it is a dissonance, and it's the root of it's like getting into the Greek church modes. It's it's in the it's all over the place in the Locrian mode and stuff like that. But
while we're on it, talking about the Diabolos and Musica, and talking about music and language, I learned the other day something that I'd never known before, that Diabolo and symbol or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The Diabolo is the tearing apart and the symbol is the putting together.
Yeah.
And I had never known that Diabolo meant the tearing apart. Although, I mean, of course, that's what the devil does in scripture, is he tries to separate that from which it's supposed to be connected. That's his whole deal, right? The Diabolo. And so maybe there is some way in which that tritone separates something.
Well, actually, that actually gets into the point of it. So the earliest thing that Adam Neely was the guy who did the video on it, and I can't remember the second part of the word, but it basically forms a Latin root that it's used in Diabolus, but it's about the pulling apart of a harmony. And part of the problem with that interval is that it's hard to sing and it's hard to harmonize, because we tend to want to either go to a perfect fourth, because the fourth and the fifth are basically sort of the most consonant harmonies, right? So we tend to pull towards the fifth and we tend to pull towards the fourth, and we tend not to do that in between note, and it sounds dissonant. And so all of this medieval stuff that where people were saying that it was conjuring the devil, nobody was writing that it was conjuring the devil. They were writing that it's hard to sing, and that the idea that it was medieval people were burning heretics at the stake for singing a flatted fifth was propagated in the 19th century, when everyone kind of liked the narrative that medieval people were stupid and superstitious, and now we're enlightened and wonderful, and now we can use tritones anytime we want because we're free people now. But it's all myth. but it's been repeated so many times
Mhm.
that people just automatically, well, obviously, and you can find all sorts of medieval music that has that interval in it, and all sorts of passing things that have that interval in it, and it's
Well,
generally
so if I could clarify what you're saying, I think what you're saying is that they use that term diabolos or whatever
yeah,
back in those days as a way of talking about that it's pulling apart this harmony, not as a way of saying that it invites the devil.
exactly.
But in the 19th century or 18th century, they interpreted it because it had the word diabolos in it. They interpreted it as having something to do with the devil. And so then they were able to look back at those stupid, ignorant people that were
Yeah, it's one of those things that, once
burning
again,
witches.
it's pretty common. The more you look at a lot of 17th or like 18th and 19th century thought, sort of post-enlightenment thought, because there's built into a lot of it the idea of medieval rubes and modern heroes and that sort of thing. We've come so far from the fools that we once were, sort of
All you have to
narrative.
do is go back and read Aquinas.
Yeah, and
I haven't come very far.
and you start to realize the narrative is determining the history that so many people are teaching, more than the actual documentation of history is.
Mhm.
And that got to be a really strong narrative, and it's persisted quite a while. But especially when you think about things like the arts, I mean, it's one thing is when you look at technology, obviously we've come a long ways, but if you look at the arts, I wouldn't say that arts are more advanced than they were. I would say they're just different. And in some ways arts have probably dropped off a bit. but certainly I wouldn't say that we're artistically far beyond where anyone was in, say, the 15th century. It's just different, and it's different context, and it's different. People's tastes are different, people's understandings are different, people's expectations are different.
Well, we certainly see, I'm going to say both the bad and the good. One of the bad things is that we don't have the kind of training that someone like J.S. Bach had, for example. The training and the discipline and the 10,000 hours that he put into learning the rules and learning how to use those rules that allowed him to create a fugue at a moment's notice out of a melody, right?
Yeah.
That's the same kind of training that an artist went through, drawing black and white for years and years until they learned to manage all the values and the forms and the black and white, and then moving on to beginning to use color and developing form and being able to do absolutely beautiful, realistic things. We don't have that kind of training in art anymore unless you really go and seek it out outside of the university system.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people are artists like me. I can't do that stuff. And so because I can't do that stuff, I do what I do,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
which I think has its own purpose, because it does carry some sort of embedded meaning within it that other people can see. And I think that's what you were talking about with the kind of music that you do as well. You produce a lot of output, and then you go and you edit it to find that which has some value so that you can create some meaning in the piece. So in that sense, there's a certain kind of creativity that we have in today's world that maybe they didn't have then, but they had the skill. If we had the skill and the creativity today, there's, and there are some people who do. I've seen some work of people who have both of those things, and what they're doing is just amazing.
Yeah. And I would say too, outside of, I think in the musical context, there's been a lot more freedom in the past compared to, I mean, if we're thinking about sort of a fine arts, I'm thinking about this as sort of a fine arts versus folk arts thing. So in the 15th century, you basically kind of had to be rich to do art.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you had to have access to this entire system in order to be able to do these things. And if you didn't have access to that, you may not have access to anything to even draw on. or to paint with, or any of those things.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that world would possibly be completely removed from you. At the very least with music, because we do have folk music for the time, most everyone, not everyone, but most everyone has a voice of varying quality and whatever else, or can, you think about some of the folk instruments, you think about, willow flutes and things like that, really simple things, but, people played them and had their own tunes and that sort of thing. So there's always been a sort of a music is probably as free as language, I guess a person could say. And I think that might be a difference in between there. And I would say, certainly from a musical standpoint, I operate far closer to a folk quality versus, an academically trained composition method. I have occasionally aped it a little bit, but that's about as close as it is aping,
Well, once you bring that up, it makes me think about Hans Zimmer, who's one of my younger daughter's absolute favorites, because she loves all the sound tracks that he's done for movies. And I saw a little piece that he did on one of those masterclass things one time. And he was saying that whenever he writes a piece of music, he first creates a question and then he answers the question.
Oh, yeah.
So he always thinks of the first couple of notes are a question. And then there's an answer, and then there's a question, and then there's an answer.
Yeah.
And that is, well, first of all, that's choice. That's the 0 or 1. That goes back to Jonathan Pageau's whole thing about the archetype of the feminine and the archetype of the masculine. That the feminine archetype is that the feminine poses the question and the masculine answers the question. And that goes all the way down, right? So I those kind of things really fascinate me. And when you write music, do you use that thing of posing a question like that? Are the first couple of notes like
I don't necessarily know that I do a question answer, but I do, particularly with and I'm gonna break this down into sort of like non-verbal melody. So because obviously if you're doing a melody with something you're singing, you're going to phrase that in language because you have to, because you're using words, right? I didn't always know that this was the case, but apparently it's possible to phrase things on an instrument in ways that aren't natural to the voice. I don't know. It's an entire thing. Phrasing music is an entire thing. But basically, I try generally to phrase it largely vocally, so that it has a pacing and that would be expected from a spoken, from a spoken voice. I guess it's. I don't know if it comes from playing the saxophone when I was a kid, where you're limited to how much wind you have in you, so you have to pace things out like by what you can actually do, so you're still limited by breath, or if it's just, but I think that's partially what we expect in things, and the spaces in phrasing is a huge thing. Phrasing is probably melodic phrasing is probably a bigger deal than nearly any technical thing you can bring up. Because I don't care how good you are as a musician, composer, whatever else, if you don't have decent melodic phrasing, your music kind of winds up being relegated to fairly limited contexts. Not saying that it's completely useless or completely pointless or whatever else. I'm not going to say that, because there's, sort of non-melodic music that still has use for people. People still, that sort of thing. But it's going to be limited, so the ability to create good musical phrases is a never-ending task, for one thing, because it's so you always listen. No, I could have done that one a little better. You just
now when you say phrasing, are you talking about that the interval and spacing between notes and the timing and the length of the phrase? Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
Almost all timing is the funny thing about it, you know, because there's the matter of pitch values, which
Mhm.
are important, but it seems like timing is more important. Like where those values land in time makes such a huge difference as far as the sort of the, for lack of a better term, quality of the phrase.
Well,
And
I'm gonna pause us here. So I'm gonna share screen and show this this pie song, because I think this might be one of these phrasing things that you're talking about. At least this will help me to understand if that's what phrasing is, because I'm not quite clear what you mean when you say musical phrasing. So this is only a couple minutes long. This is just the intro to the song. Hasn't started yet. So maybe that's far enough to get the idea. I think that's pretty amazing. He did that when he was 12 years old.
oh wow.
There's another video online that is him today talking about how he did that when he was 12, and then kind of bringing up the memorabilia, showing the old charts and everything that he wrote down, and he was using some sort of really old computer back then. It was 2006, so of course that's the ancient phase. And this old computer and some old software that you can't even put on a modern computer, and how he did that. But now there isn't any real rhythm in the right hand. It just seems like those are all even notes, and yet there's something about what he's doing with the left hand that creates a kind of a phrasing for me that makes the notes make sense. Otherwise, they didn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. And really the phrasing is sort of, if you think about it, like melodic phrasing, like, okay, so if you have the accompaniment, we'll say, providing the context, the phrasing will be where the melody sits in relation to the context that's being provided by the other. So you have time, for example, as part of the context. So if you have, this was approximately the tempo of that piano piece. It varied a little bit, but it was about like that. I can't really snap my finger very well right now because I got a Band-Aid on my thumb, so it kind of goes thwomp. But so if that's your approximate, and now there's just leaving a melody out of it, you could do dun dun da 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 dun dun, or you could do dun da 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 dun 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 dun, depending. And if you're speaking,
so the left hand is doing all of that in this particular piece. Okay.
Yeah. So it's and in that case, if the melody is determined by pi, then the left hand is basically creating a context that makes the melody musical, really, or makes it make sense. It gives it a context that allows it to be musical.
But it's, in my mind, it must have taken him quite a bit of time to figure out the harmonies to create with the left hand that would make sense out of that
Yeah.
melody, because the melody is completely random.
Yeah.
And yet it's quite beautiful.
Well, yeah, it is, and it's funny too because it makes me, oh, settle down, buddy. My
Must be
dog.
time to go.
Yeah, he's he's telling me it's school time, I guess, but it's but no, it's interesting because in that sense it's a little bit kind of like 12-tone music, but it's not really, because, well, it probably is. I'd have to look in more into it, but with sort of well considered harmonizing, you can take something like that and make it work and make it musical, make it nice. It's funny because, like so many of these other things, music is basically relational. It's relational within itself, as far as, the instruments or voices or what have you making sense with one another. And then it's relational externally in the sense that generally, in standard musical usage, music is for people. So there's the relational aspect between the music, the person who wrote the music, the performer, etc., and the people who are listening. Because even if music is only being listened to by the person who wrote it, there's still a relational element where you go from being creator to observer, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily experience that when I listen to my own stuff, unless it's been a lot of years since I did it, because otherwise I'm just judging.
Oh no, it takes time. I mean, I have drawers full of paintings that I did like 10 years ago, drawers full. And after like 10 years, I'll go back and look at something that at the time I stuck in a drawer because I was afraid to show it to anybody.
Yeah.
And I look at it now and I go, there's something there.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if it would have any value to anybody, but when I look at it now, I can see. At the time, I had no idea why I did what I did or how it even happened. And yet I look at it now and I think, yeah, there's something there.
Yeah.
But one of the things I wanted to say about the music being relational within itself, you said music is relational. Just before that, you were talking about something, accompaniment, providing the context. Oh, now I've lost it. It'll come back probably. Yeah. Music being relational, that's a very important thing somehow. But there was one thing I wanted to ask you before we leave, and this is about, I think it's Beethoven's Ninth. Is that the da 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 da?
I think that's the fifth.
Oh, the fifth. Okay, Beethoven's fifth. Da 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 da. You remember that little thing I showed you on Wolfram's Theory, with the triangle and then the one line.
Yeah.
3 in 1. It almost sounds like the whole beginning of that song. He's saying 3 in 1, 3 in 1, 3 in 1. Da 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 da.
Yeah.
Da 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 da. Bum bum. Right? 3 in 1, 3 in 1. It's like trying to drive into our hearts, the 3 in 1.
Yeah.
Was Beethoven a Christian? Do you know anything about his history?
I mean, I don't know to what degree he was or wasn't, outside of the context of his time.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little.
Yeah, I guess within any time it's a little iffy, right? Because there were so many threads going through every.
Yeah.
That's the interesting thing about history. When you go back looking at it, you realize that we only have this one picture of history that's a particular thread that historians have followed, but there's all sorts of other threads that the historians didn't look at or don't know anything about,
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Well, and that's where it's one of those things where it is important, even if it isn't always like easy to do. Sometimes history doesn't necessarily make it easy to paint an easy narrative to work with on certain things, but yeah, sometimes it's hard to, well, to use the example of Beethoven. This one is, if you ever get a chance, look up the Grand Fugue by Beethoven. This was sort of like kind of, I think it was pretty much, fugues were kind of a thing of the past by this point, because this was the very early 19th century. And Beethoven wrote this, and this was so he composed this thing, and this was, in his mind, this was the greatest thing he had ever composed. This was his best work, period. And if you listen to it, it's technically extremely intricate, and it has concepts going on in there. It sounds 100 years newer than it is. It does. It sounds like it's from the early 1900s instead of from the early 1800s. It sounds 100 years newer than it is. It's very avant-garde for its time. It didn't go over well. It didn't go over well at all, and he hated the audience. You know, like when it debuted, I remember it was when the quote was something like, "Fools and asses, they asked for encores for the other stuff, and the fugue was the only thing worth listening to." And so he composed this thing that he thought was his grand triumph, and it didn't go over great because people couldn't understand it. And
it's probably a little bit like, you know, how these older musicians go around and do their last hurrah concert series, and like a few years back, I had the opportunity to go hear Ray Charles, and I mean, I was a young woman when Ray Charles was singing Georgia. You know, well, I don't know when he did Georgia and all those things, but when I was a young woman, I just loved that music. I listened to it all the time, and so a few years back, we get this opportunity to go listen to Ray Charles in concert. It's like, oh my gosh, this is going to be amazing. And he did all new music, none of which made any sense to me at all. And he didn't do any of his favorites. And so I was kind of disappointed because, you know, I had gone expecting one thing. And so I can imagine that people that went and listened to Beethoven were expecting one thing, and instead they get this new thing that's out of its time. It's not, you know, people aren't ready for it. And
and that sort of thing can happen, you know. So it's an interesting little story about Beethoven anyway, where his great accomplishment didn't exactly meet with a whole lot of accolades until, of course, well, it's kind of like Bach. I mean, Bach wasn't recognized as much of a composer in his day. He was known as a great improviser and as, you know, a good teacher and, you know, choir master, that sort of thing, but not like people were, you know, seeking out J.S. Bach scores or anything like that.
So at the time, was he known for writing school books for children, like the Bach Inventions? Were they actual compositions that he did that that we now use to teach piano students, or were they actually done to teach piano students?
I think a lot of that was done for teaching, and then of course he wrote so much church music. It was, you know, Bach cantatas after cantatas after cantatas, you know. So you know, a lot of that. So, you know, that's part of the reason so much of his work survived, you know, because it went straight into that, you know, church environment. So
we are the recipients of a rich musical history.
Absolutely,
I have to say.
And this time, and this is I don't know, this is probably fodder for another conversation at some point, but the fact that we have access to recorded music of the past affords us, I think, a different opportunity to be. I have this theory on with music that way, and with photography, to be backwards referential in ways that traditionally weren't the case. So, for example, while there were scores, there was written music, whatever, you know, the majority of music that was being played, say in 1870, probably wasn't off of sheet music. If you think about it, just throughout the world, for the most part, music was like stuff played at weddings. And it was passed down from person to person to person to person, and they were playing the songs that the people at the wedding wanted to hear, or that sort of thing. You know, you had your sacred music, and that was, you know, sort of held in a different regard. You had your folk music that was, you know, external to that. But so what did people wind up listening to in their lives? What had been handed to them and what was being composed at the time, you know, up until we have the, you know, the mass publication of sheet music, the mass learning of how to play music, and then eventually the creation of recorded music, which is, you know, what late 1800s, early 1900s in there. Okay, so now I can go back, I can listen to all sorts, I can listen to recordings of all of the sheet music that's been collected through time, and I can also listen to recordings of everything up until, today, which no one's ever been able to do until the last century or so. Photography is another one. And you think about, like, aside from some paintings, you didn't have pictures of people. And I was thinking about this with relation to, like, okay, like so like torn stonewashed jeans and mullets are back in style for young people, which is very high school for me. And I think, like, would this stuff ever have circled back if it weren't for photographs of these kids' parents? Because I don't know of a situation in the 1840s where people were like, we really should start dressing like the 1790s again, because they had it figured out. I mean, I think that's this sort of constant backward reference when it comes to trends, when it comes to, I mean, you see it with music, you see it with the art world, you see it with whatever. But sort of popular trends being backwards referential, I think that's I don't know, that might be a newer phenomenon, partially based on the fact that we actually can access representations from that period where we couldn't up until really pretty recently in human history.
Well, that makes sense to me, because if you think about, like, the artists during the Renaissance period, when they painted pictures of Mary and Joseph, they were painting them wearing clothes that were from the Renaissance period, not from, because they didn't know anything about how they were dressed back in the day, right?
Yeah.
So you see Mary wearing these elaborate gowns. That wasn't happening. I don't think that was happening back then. It was way too hard to make something by hand to make it that elaborate.
And it doesn't even have to be that much time to have passed. I remember what I was looking at it was some Icelandic manuscript about a Viking named Egil Skallagrimsson, and I think it was written and drawn in, like, the, I don't know, 15 or 1600s. And so you have this Viking guy who looks exactly like any sort of knight from the 15 or 1600s. He's got the different helmet, and he's got a different, it's like, well, why would they know what their countrymen from 400, 500 years earlier would have looked like?
Mm-hmm.
I guess that goes
and it's a funny thing about the music. You were talking about music notation and having sheet music and everything, but from what I understand, that during Boethius's time, the notation that they used, we still don't understand. So we have no way of knowing what music sounded like back then. Yeah. Or even what scales they were. Well, we know that they were using Pythagorean harmonics, but we don't know what the music sounded like. And when you look at the notation, you can understand why they can't interpret it. It's very weird. Yeah.
And you don't know really, well, I mean, you have an idea of how they tuned, but how things were played relative to each other, you don't really know how that's going to work out. And it's interesting. The thing that is interesting to me with respect to Western music, I mean, in a way, the Indian approach, where you have far more notes within sort of your octave range, in a way makes more sense if you can get your ear to accommodate it. Because, I mean, even like a lot of ethnic music and that sort of thing uses, very, like, small segments of semitones, just little pitch things that, don't necessarily fit into a really rigid Western structure, 12-tone structure. But, at some point, this got to be an agreed upon thing with a lot of people, that this is what sounds good. And it's interesting how did that consensus develop? How did, people come about saying, okay, well, we think that these things all sound pretty good. I mean, it's obviously a lot of people, a lot of music over a lot of years, but it's just sort of interesting to me when I mean, it could be a fairly random thing. I mean, the mathematical ratios will explain a few things that fit pretty nicely, like octaves and fifths, and then beyond that a little bit. But as we've learned with tempered tuning, just because the frequency numbers look nice doesn't necessarily mean that they sound nice.
Mhm.
So we've basically all kind of agreed that, well, this is what sounds nice. But well, I guess we haven't all, but within the realm of Western music, we kind of have.
Well, I for one can't wait to get to my piano and try a Diabolo and Musica diminished fifth and see what it sounds like.
Well,
See if I've ever used one, because
it's
or you're going to play one for us.
there you go. That's A. Can you hear that? Is it coming through at all?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's an A and there's a E flat.
Well, as a melody, it's not too bad. As a harmony, it's just awful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when you go up and down the scale like that, I can hear it being a riff, right? But just by itself, it doesn't fit the ear at all. But that was one of the funny things that happened to me when I started taking art classes, was that before I started really exploring all the avenues of what art could do, my musical tastes were very simple. I like simple harmonies and, simple melodies, and I like things that were singable. And then as I started exploring more and more aspects of abstract and semi-abstract art and got more complex in my visual cortex, my ears were much more open to a lot of complexities in music.
Yeah.
And it happened simultaneously. And it wasn't something I went seeking, which is a funny thing to me.
That's interesting. And I think it kind of goes with a form of, maybe there's a receptivity maybe that comes with finding new forms of openness. Yeah, I mean, I know within my own life, like I go through periods where I'm like really receptive to new music ideas, that sort of thing. And then other times when like I just don't care. Just like, no, I'm just fine where I am. And then other times where I'm looking for something new. And probably the closest thing I've had to that, I guess within recent memory, was when this is something that should probably be evident to everybody, but it wasn't evident to me. But two types of music that I couldn't quite wrap my head around as far as why people enjoyed them. I couldn't figure out rap, and I couldn't figure out some elements of country music. Like, okay, country I could get a little bit, but the rap thing, I was like, I understood, like in the 80s, it was kind of a novelty thing. So I was a kid, okay, whatever. But then it just suddenly dawned on me one day. It's like, okay, I just said, okay, I'm gonna figure this out. I'm gonna sit down, I'm gonna listen to some, Tupac or whatever, and figure out what the deal is. Why am I not getting this? Because there are millions of people who think this has immense value. I'm obviously not getting it. I mean, outside of like, okay, well, I guess there's a poetic and verse element that I get there, but it's like that's not going to make me crank it in my car day in and day out, right? So then I'm sitting there listening to it, and it just dawned on me like I was a complete moron. Like, well, they're using it for something different than you use music for. So if I'm sitting there and I'm listening to Tales of Topographic Oceans by Yes or something, I'm going on this wild musical adventure with all of these changes and things happening and whatever else. That's not what that's for. Rap, it's for something completely different. There's a completely different use for it. And then I just thought to myself, like, oh wow, I just never actually had realized before that I use music. That music is something, it's not just something that I like that, so I'm going to listen to it. It's sort of built in. I use music for this, and that's why I choose what I choose to listen to. And so, the use determines the choice, but I wasn't even aware of that in the past at all. And then once I did that, I mean, I guess I'm still not sitting around listening to Tupac, but at least I had a lot better understanding. Like, okay, when people are sitting around listening to rap, they're doing something different than what I'm doing. If I'm sitting there with headphones on listening to a Bach fugue, or sitting there, it's probably closer to just like driving around listening to Van Halen or something. I don't know, but it's like that's you know. But just understanding that, just getting out of my own head a little bit and kind of figuring out where I myself was coming from on it, because prior to that,
what was your conclusion about country music?
a similar sort of thing. Well, it's a similar sort of thing, really. It's a way for people to hear stories they can relate to in some way or find entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an easier time with that, especially in the sense of like older country songs. Like I never had a huge problem with old country music. Like newer country, I don't know. It
Newer
seemed,
country seems so glitzy to me. I mean, the old country has a lot of pathos and
yeah.
and I think a more imperfection. I think it's the beauty of the imperfection of the vocals in the older country that makes it so enticing.
Yeah, and I think the songwriting, particularly from lyrical slants, was a lot stronger. You know, and it really, the country music industry kind of took over really sort of like the MTV rock side of things. That's where it got to be so glitzy and you know, sort of big production things, and big on production, low on message, I guess. And in my mind, like country music that's lacking in lyrical quality is really lacking in everything, because that's the number one place where the quality ever was. You know, you'd have country songs that were either about, you know, like, you know, whether it was like George Jones, He Stopped Loving Her Today, or whether it's something like Amos Moses by Jerry Reed, you know, two opposite sides of the coin, you know. But you know, in one case, one's, you know, this heartfelt thing, the other one is this, you know, funny whimsical song. But you know, when it's, you know, every song is about, you know, like she's a country girl, or, you know, like, you know, in a pickup truck on a dirt road by a cornfield. Oh, good Lord. You know, like it's about nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. At that point, it becomes what I call elevator music.
Yeah.
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 Well, this has been really great. I hope we can do it again. About some other things. I feel like we've kind of gone to the moon and back, exploring a lot of different things. But one of the things I'm going to take away from this is that music is relational, because I think that's like a super important point about all of the arts, is the relational aspect, because it's relational, first of all, because there has to, at least for certain kinds of music, there is a relationship first with the creator that is creating this impulse, this desire to create in us, and the desire to make music. So there's that relation. Then there's the relation between the musical creator and their creation. And then there's the relationship between the creation itself and the audience. And so you get this thing going on, and painting is certainly that way.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that all the other arts are that way, and all of creation is that way. And so I'm very simple person, so I'm always simplifying down. So everything is relational, everything is proportional. I used to say everything was context, but that's not strictly true, because if everything is context, then postmodernism is true. So I don't think it's just context. I think it's proportion.
Yeah.
But it's proportion and balance and a lot of those other things. Anyway, this has been great. And for people who are still listening, Travis has a website, traviswoyen.com, and I will put that on the description. If there's anything else you want me to put in the description about you or about your work, or any ideas that you have, or videos that you'd like people to watch, I'll do that.
I think we could just put a link to my YouTube channel in the description. You can probably hear, I don't know, probably more music than anyone's probably likely to listen through all through it. And then just some other stuff about like guitar playing and stuff like that too. So
sure. So if you can send me those links, then I can put them in there. And if you're still listening, like, subscribe, whatever it takes. When I looked this morning, I was at 998. And so, you know, I'm not counting really, but it would be kind of fun to break 1,000.
Maybe a bit for Christmas.
Yeah. Although I noticed once I got up close to 1,000, they started dropping off. That's never happened before. It almost is not like the algorithm is trying to say, no, we're not going to let you break 1,000.
Yeah.
I got up to 996 and then went down to 994. And then I got up to 998 and it went back down to 996. And oh, the vicissitudes of a YouTube channeler.
Well, that's just it.
Yeah.
But you've been cranking them out though. You've had a lot of videos lately.
Well, I just love having these conversations. There's so much to be learned, and
Yeah.
it's
So-
good
so
catching up
I-
with you again with your Minnesota accent. There's still a little bit of that in me, but it's mostly washed out after all these
Yeah.
years.
It doesn't take long for it to come back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I talk to you too much, it'll be back. So I better.
Well, it's like if I go home, it gets thicker. So there's that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
very, very good talking to you, Travis. And I'm looking forward to, hopefully there'll be a lot of comments on this. We'll be able to get some ideas from people that we can learn from. And oh, I have a quote here that on that Boethius video that I thought was interesting, that both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche thought that music was the most real thing in the universe without which life was not possible.
Yeah. Which is interesting. And I guess this is probably getting into another video here, but
Well, I always like to leave with a little teaser for what's coming up.
well, part of it, okay, there's a couple of things, but I think music with regard to sort of the ancient way of, or more ancient, not even necessarily ancient way of viewing it. You know, when you talk about you know, the movement of the spheres, or basically the musical proportionality of the movement of the planets, the interrelations with people, that sort of thing, all being considered elements of music by Boethius. That has implications that we don't tend to apply to music today. And so I think that also would tend to make people give music a different level of importance. If you're talking about, if you're describing the movement of the planets, if you're describing interactions within societies and things like that within musical terms, then you're using music as a far more encompassing concept than just notes on a page or songs, you know, here or there. So
that does sound like a good topic, and we could bring in that lovely quote from Jordan Peterson where he starts talking about how when a piece of music comes back together, it's like all the levels of reality line up, and when that happens, that's the point of meaning in life right there.
And there are things happening. There are things that happen with music and people and minds that they can't really explain. I certainly can't explain.
Well, I mean, it gets into the whole psychedelic experience, right? You can have a psychedelic experience through music without ever touching a psychedelic. So
yeah, exactly.
But that's for another conversation.
There we are. Yeah.
Have a great day. Have a great holiday.
Yes,
Have a Merry Christmas. I'll be bold and say have a Merry Christmas.
There we are. You do the same.
Thank you, Travis. Bye-bye.